What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Visions of Mana, a JRPG that released back in August, I believe, that I couldn't quite make time for during the busier part of the year, so here we are now. That said, Visions of Mana is the latest entry in the Mana series, which hadn't seen a mainline entry in quite some time, and because of that, I was eager to, when I got a chance, double back and take a look at it, which is obviously what we're doing here. But with that in mind, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked below that goes over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Though, in the case of Visions of Mana here, the achievements are pretty thorough, and it's been out a while, so it's a pretty easy 100% if you're willing to look up a few things. Really, I'd say the only thing that's genuinely annoying is the bestiary, as you have to fill that out entirely, but mostly just tedious, which is hardly anything new. Also worth a mention that with how late I am covering this, given when it released, unsurprisingly no review copy there. I actually bought it personally recently during the winter sale for about $40, so there's that information for you. But to give a brief overview of what I want to talk about and some of the things I think this game does well, for the most part I would say Visions of Mana is fun, but it doesn't quite live up to its own ambition in a lot of cases. I think some things fall a little flat. The story kind of falls apart at the end, and then the pacing of said story and even progression is off. I spent most of the game under level 30, and then within the span of like an hour and a half jumped up about 30 levels towards the end, to give some examples of what I'm talking about here. But at the same time, I wouldn't outright call any of it bad either. But let's dive fully into some of that, starting with the technical side of things. How is this game running? So for the most part, this game ran pretty well for me. I ran into a few minor issues, like every once in a while my character would get stuck on terrain and I would have to teleport away to fix it. Sometimes the auto run would just stop working, which is supposed to happen in towns, but then you would leave town and then it would just continue to not work. And that would usually be fixed by simply leaving. And then, as with basically any JRPG, there are some oddities in terms of the localization and English translation. Some of it does seem a little bit awkward. Probably most bizarrely, I would say, is that one of the main characters of the game, one of your main party members, has like a thick southern accent, which is funny because I live in the South. And while that's not inherently a problem in and of itself, I actually like seeing more diverse accents like that with these characters. It's odd because like no one else in the village she's from talks like that, just as a general example. But for the most part, the game ran fine, didn't have any substantial issues, just a few minor issues. Moving on though, let's talk about difficulty and New Game Plus. So the game does feature a host of difficulties to start the game with, beginner through hard. And then after you beat the game for the first time, you'll unlock both New Game Plus, but also Expert difficulty, which can then be applied to the game you are currently on, so you don't have to start New Game Plus to use it, just as an aside. As far as the difficulties go, beginner allows you to revive after you lose, so you are in effect unable to actually be defeated, whereas the higher you go up in difficulty otherwise, it primarily seems to affect how much damage enemies deal and how much health they have. So basically the standard stuff, but otherwise nothing else really seems to change, best I can tell. But then we have New Game Plus, like I mentioned. Obviously have to beat the game at least once to make that happen, but New Game Plus doesn't really do anything differently besides letting you carry forward your previous progress, and I do mean pretty much all of that previous progress. Basically, you get to keep everything that isn't like a quest-related item that would allow you to skip something, and then enemies and their levels and placement and all that still stays the same, so it's pretty much just another run through with a higher level character. So even if you were to run through New Game Plus on Expert difficulty, you'd likely find it a fair bit easier than, say, starting a new game with it. So certainly something to know. But with that out of the way, let's talk story setup and my thoughts on it, because despite the, I would say, relatively kid-friendly graphics, the game's central theme is relatively dark, actually. It involves human sacrifice to the Tree of Mana to restore the lands so they can basically have abundant crops and generally sustain life. And while that's a pretty interesting premise, unfortunately I would say it kind of falls apart towards the end. Now, beyond saying just that, which is basically everything you need to know going into this if you don't want spoilers, I am going to be mentioning some spoilery stuff just because there's some stuff in there I want to talk about. about, so if you don't want to hear any of that, maybe go ahead and skip ahead. But otherwise, we're going to dig a little deeper here. So as I mentioned, the world basically hinges around people called alms being sent to sacrifice themselves to the Tree of Mana in order to provide sustenance for everyone else. This is apparently so popular that they basically have an abundance of volunteers to do it because it's seen as some great honor, which kind of is counter to, I would say, self-preservation, but that's the world we are expected to come to grips with, which, truth be told, I initially thought was kind of funny because of the juxtaposition of that dark theme, with even kids being excited at the prospect of being picked to do this, set against the backdrop of this colorful and kind of cutesy art style, which is odd to me, and that's actually a pretty interesting premise, and there are parts of the story and characters that bring that up about how nobody questions it, and it's seen as just this thing that you have to do. And that part of the story was pretty interesting, but unfortunately it falls off a bit because there comes a part in the story where the actual big bad gets revealed after, unsurprisingly, some things with the journey to sacrifice the alms to the tree goes sideways. This ultimately results in the big bad of the game being released upon the world, where he seeks to destroy the mana tree, which would ultimately result in the doom of the entire land. Now, through that, we kind of learn why these sacrifices are necessary and what their purpose is, and I don't want to get into all of that. It was decently interesting, if not a gripping tale. The issues came right towards the end of the game, though, when they finally reveal the motivation of the big bad, and it turned out to be really uninteresting, I would say. Apparently, the big bad initially saved the world one time, only to come home and find that while he was gone doing that, the love of his life was murdered by common bandits, and rather than seek the people responsible for this act, he decided that the entire world had to burn, which is some pretty thin motivation at best. And given that I already wasn't super into the story as it was, it caused it to kind of end on a sour note for me. But up to that point, it was fairly decent. Now, after you beat the game for the first time and unlock New Game Plus and everything, if you first load your game complete save, you'll actually unlock an extra chapter to the game that doesn't really change the ending, but does allow you to wrap up one of the unresolved plot threads before that point, as well as fight some extra bosses. For the most part, these are higher level versions of bosses you've already fought, which isn't very interesting, but two of them, the game's super boss, as well as the boss of that last chapter, are more interesting overall. So it's not the worst story I've ever seen or anything, but I didn't love it either. That, though, brings us to our progression systems. Progression is decently interesting in this game, actually. There's a fair bit going on there that allows you to customize characters quite a bit, but a few notes there in particular is that it gets off to a pretty slow start. There's a lot that has to happen before you can start fully customizing these characters. And then, as I mentioned, there came that point where I suddenly jumped up 30 levels in like an hour, which was certainly a bit odd. But let's talk about it. Now, generally, like most JRPGs, really, as we defeat enemies, we'll gather experience. This is going to increase our levels, which will increase your stats generally. But what each character is really capable of largely comes down to their elemental vessel or their class. There are 8 of these. You'll gather them up over the course of the initial part of the story, and once you have all 8 of them, you can swap between them with your different party members in order to change their class as well as their elemental affinity. Now, our main character here, Val, alongside the other characters we'll pick up, Karina, Palomina, Morley, and Jule, all have a sort of base class that they have when nothing else is equipped in terms of their elemental vessel. But when they equip an elemental vessel, they are assigned a new class and an elemental affinity to go with it. This is important for a few different reasons, because it dictates the type of weapon they're going to be having equipped. Each individual character has 3 different weapon types that one of their 8 classes will pick from. What's more, though, these classes will alter, of course, the stats of that character based on what that class is supposed to be for. It also, through its elemental affinity, grants you bonuses and access to certain moves that are either useful or useless against other enemies with different elemental affinities, as enemies can be either resistant or immune to the affinity that you have. This won't stop your basic weapon attacks from working, but the elemental attacks from that class will obviously be greatly hampered if the enemy is resistant or immune to them. So once you have all of these and you're choosing between them and you can actually have one equipped on each character, that opens up some interesting possibilities, largely through the elemental plot system. Once you've unlocked these classes, you can then power them up by spending elemental power on the elemental plots, basically a skill line for that class that grants you access to both passives that are just for that class as well as abilities that you can use regardless, giving you progression both for individual classes but also that character at large, giving them access to more and more abilities that they can use either from all of their classes or just a specific one. And again, when you start putting that together with other systems, it gets to be pretty fun, but unfortunately the pace of the progression limits the amount of time you're actually going to fully get to use all of this progression, which is unfortunate. Now, the other part of that, though, is the ability seeds. Ability seeds are effectively either passives or moves that can be assigned to a character without actually having to do it through a class. These can be things like, again, simple stat increases, increasing their life, their individual stats, or providing more interesting effects, such as making them completely immune to status effects or specific status effects, or giving you a chance to petrify enemies on a normal attack, that kind of thing. So when you start mixing and matching those ability seeds with all the different things you can do with the classes and their elemental stuff, which we'll get into during the combat section, there is actually a pretty robust character system here that unfortunately doesn't get as much playtime as I would have liked. Now, your elemental plots and your total number of abilities is going to come down to your expansion items. You don't get full access to both of those systems straight away, but rather throughout the course of the game, you can find items that will allow you to expand both the elemental plot that you have access to, basically the tiers of it, and then other expansion items that will grant you access to more ability slots, up to a maximum of 10 of them. So there's a bit of progression there as well. Some of those are just found in the environment, and then the final one for both is actually from a vendor in the final secret chapter. And then last but not least, we actually have gear. Gear is probably the least interesting part of progression here, simply because it is extremely linear. As I mentioned, each of the different classes will typically use one of 3 different weapons for each character. So you'll swap gear in that sense, but otherwise gear progression is extremely linear and none of it really does anything interesting. So all in all, progression was actually pretty solid, but the pacing of it and how quickly or long it takes to unlock said progression is a little dull, which leads to combat and everything being extremely slow in the start, getting really good, only for you to skyrocket ahead all of a sudden at the end, and it just feels like a roller coaster all over the place. Now, some of that is going to be affected by Lil Cactus. There is a cactus you'll encounter as part of the story initially, and afterwards you have to find this cactus at various locations throughout the game. Doing so gives you access to a whole host of buffs, the most important of which happen to be a huge increase to your experience gain. Once you find enough, it's initially a 50% buff, only to later then jump to a 100% buff, giving you double XP. Which is certainly a cause for some of that huge jump in experience and the spikiness of the progression. So something to know for sure. But from there, let's talk the gameplay and world of this one. So Visions of Mana operates on a sort of segmented open area system. The closest thing I could compare it to really is something like Final Fantasy XII, where there's just a ton of small interconnected areas that make up the larger continents that you'll be exploring. And some of these areas are very large, other areas are basically just cities or more settlement-oriented areas where you're not really in combat, and there's not nearly as much exploration as a result. Unsurprisingly, you'll be moving through a lot of these areas as part of the story, gaining access to more and more as you go. This will eventually lead you to the ability to traverse different continents you'll find yourself on, either by sailing the ocean via the giant sea king turtle thing, or later on you get a flying dragon that will ferry you from place to place. But in these open areas, there's a few things to do, but not necessarily a ton. So for starters, the elements play a pretty big role in it. As you start to gather up elemental vessels, these also play a role in exploration, as they will give you access to new areas by allowing you to interact with the environment in some way, such as lifting rocks up to help you forward, acting as a sort of grappling hook potentially, or just straight rocketing you from one place to another. There's a few different options and they were decently fun. You can also find chests scattered in between enemies. Enemies also play a role in this, obviously being the source of our experience and everything, but also we can occasionally find some of them that are known as a nemesis. These guys are stronger, naturally, basically named variants of other enemies, and killing them usually leads to better rewards, as you might imagine. The strongest of which typically guard ancient ruins. These ancient ruins, if you destroy their roving bands of monsters that are guarding them, you'll open up the central part of the ruins, which will gain you access to one of the nemesis enemies to fight, which will then lead to a much better item to be found, typically in the form of a weapon. Then then there are the Aries. Elemental Aries become available as you start picking up elemental vessels that coordinate with them, but these are basically challenges you can take on. They seem to scale with your character level and not so much difficulty, or at least not in any way that I could tell. So these are more set in stone challenges that scale to you, the player, to provide the specific challenge they're trying to provide, and usually they involve using your elemental vessels in some way. Some of these are pretty fun, some I didn't like at all, so kind of a mixed bag there. Now the other big activity you'll be doing while you're exploring all these areas is naturally side quests. So side quests make up a huge amount of this game. In fact, I would say you could probably cut 10 to 15 hours off an already relatively short title simply by not approaching these side quests. There's something like, I think, 120 of them total. A lot of them are not very interesting, but there are some better ones in there that follow a sort of set storyline and give you a little more information about the world and how it works. I enjoyed those ones, but by and large, these were extremely tedious, especially once you get towards the end of the game and you actually start needing to do certain side quests in order to get items that are required to complete other side quests, and it's just a lot. And unsurprisingly, it starts to be not fun pretty fast, but there were nonetheless a few decent ones in there. So putting all that together, gameplay and world-wise, it's okay. Some of it's not very interesting naturally, but some of it is pretty good at the same time and enjoyable, like certain airy challenges were pretty cool. And I even enjoyed going through some of the game's dungeons and seeing some of the puzzles involved there, and obviously the art style is great, so it's not all bad, mind you. It's just a little bit of a mixed bag. Which brings us to the combat section. So combat for this game is interesting because it starts off very slow. You're basically just spamming attack to win. That goes on for quite some time while the game introduces characters and everything, but eventually you'll start getting access to better and better gear and stuff like I mentioned, and then the combat starts to get pretty good where you have to pay attention to elemental weaknesses and stuff and swap out your classes appropriately. Start learning what elemental breaks are, which we'll talk about, and how that stuff works, and then all of a sudden the progression ramps up again and you're like 30 levels ahead of everything you're fighting. Not even so much trying to be so, just because you did the extra side content, you're suddenly a massive level ahead of every other enemy, so it becomes trivially easy again. And here I think it's really to the game's detriment, because there's a solid character system under here that I would have liked to have played around with more and met with more challenging encounters, but because of the way the game is paced and set up, you'd basically have to intentionally not do a bunch of content in order to make that happen, which isn't a lot of fun. But let's talk a little bit about what combat has to offer. Now, I already talked a little bit about this with the elemental vessels and their affinities and how you need to swap them out appropriately, otherwise, some of your special abilities won't do anything. But what are those abilities? Well, every elemental vessel has a sort of basic attack you'll get access to that typically goes on cooldown for a while after you use it based on the mana that you're taking in. But for instance, the fire elemental vessel gives you a sort of charge attack where you can run into things. The dark elemental vessel will allow you to grapple enemies to you if they're small, or you to them if they're big. The light elemental vessel actually links a bunch of enemies together, so damage is shared among them, just as some examples. But those are all, of course, damage-wise associated with the element applying them. But if you get charged up enough, elemental vessels can also perform what is called a break. An elemental break changes the entire battlefield to be associated with that element, which can do a few different things. For instance, the dark one will actually group up all of the enemies in a central place with a sort of gravity spell so you can easily AoE them down, whereas the light one will actually link every single enemy on the battlefield to share damage together, which can again be really great for AoE spells. And combining all those different elements with the more basic elements of combat has the potential to be a pretty fun time. Now, generally speaking, you have the weapon your character is actually using with the class they are using, which has a light and a heavy attack, or a special attack as the game prefers to call it, as sometimes it's not necessarily an attack. As for instance, Val's Paladin class actually has the option to just block, which is nice. Most characters just have to dodge out of the way normally. And that's noteworthy because this is definitely a game that prioritizes melee combatants. And this is because casting takes a minute. You also have to assign moves to a sort of ring menu, which can't really be done in combat. You need to do it outside of combat. And all of that casting is limited by your MP, and your MP is pretty limited until you get to the late game anyway, but when you get to the late game, you have some potentially very long fights where managing your MP is a big part of it, which means that you'll likely not want to spend it on just casting your way through those fights, provided you're playing on a decent difficulty. So because of that, the game does seem to prioritize melee, especially for the fights that are more of a marathon than a sprint. So basically, magic could be really useful in some situations, but by and large, it was pretty easy to ignore it, especially since the elemental vessels would usually give you better effects overall anyway, outside of just buffing you and debuffing the enemy. I didn't really use magic a ton. And that's before we start talking about class strikes. So as you fight enemies that take damage and give damage, specifically, you'll start filling your class strike gauge. This is shared between all of your party members, but when it's full, you'll perform a big elemental attack based on your current class. So if you're fire, it's going to do fire. If you're dark, it's going to do dark, etc. The class strike is really good, A, because it hits everything around you in a huge AoE, but also because it pulls everything into an animation. This means that if you time your class strike properly, you can actually use it to cancel out bosses' big moves, because the class strike will sort of forcibly reset the enemies when it ends out of its little cutscene, which is a useful tip for some things like the super bosses, by the way. But using the class strike at the opportune moment, really across many battles, can be a way of saving yourself a bit of headache here and there, even if none of the game is terribly difficult. But then we have the AI for the other party members. So as you've probably seen on screen here, while we do have 5 party members total, we'll only have 3 of them with us in combat at any given time. We're only controlling one of them at a time. You can switch, but I mostly kept to Val personally. The other characters not controlled by you are controlled by your strategy AI. Basically, you can set up generally what you want these characters to do and how much of their own resources or items they will use. For the most part, it works well enough for what it is, but there are some bosses and enemies in the late game that this is just woefully unprepared to deal with, and even then, outside of those fights, a lot of times you'll have a lot of problems trying to get these characters to move out of an AoE that any human would know to just move. So I wouldn't exactly call it a masterpiece in AI, but it works decently well for what it's trying to do. But you may run into some problems using it, as I certainly know I did. And that might be more of an issue because your items actually have to be set up before the battle as well. In order to use items, you have to assign them to the menu for items that you can activate in combat, sort of prepping them beforehand, if you will. But even then, once you have those items prepped, no matter how many you actually have, the game will limit you to 9 of them while the game is actually being played in that combat round. So no matter how many revives you have on you, you can only use 9 of them at a max per battle, which is notable for the super bosses, because while it's not an issue in and of itself, when combined with AI that isn't always the brightest, even when you set it up, can become an issue. So overall, combat and progression, again, in and of itself, it's actually pretty good, but I just don't think the game is set up in a way that really lets it shine as much as it could, which is a bit of a bummer. That, though, does bring us to the Steam Deck section of this one. So the Steam Deck is an interesting conversation because it actually runs pretty terribly for the demo of the game, bizarrely, which I wanted to mention specifically. The Steam Deck for the main version of the game actually seems to run pretty well, provided you're not huge on 60 FPS specifically. Visions of Mana runs very well if you're only looking for 30 FPS, and you can definitely get it above that, but a stable 60 is hard to manage. And that's important because certain bosses and things like that will occasionally cause the frame rate to dip, which I have to assume is probably because of all the combat animations, but otherwise it plays pretty well there, no big issues. That said, the game's official rating is playable, and this comes down to text on screen. I didn't really have an issue with this personally, but some of these screens do have a lot of information and small text on them, so that could potentially be an issue for you, which is something to know, I suppose, but otherwise I think it's perfectly playable there, and should be a decent experience for most, I would imagine. Which brings us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, I think the positives for me really were Visions of Mana's approach to the overall combat system as well as the progression systems. Those are interesting things to get engaged with, even if I don't think they're exactly well supported by the rest of the game, which is unfortunate due to the way things are set up and laid out. In addition to that, I also enjoyed some of the dungeons and the art design. I think a lot of that stuff was really cool to look at and explore, even if it's not exactly a technical marvel. But then we have the negatives. Basically, the negatives for me are a lot of little things that keep this game from reaching its full potential, not least of which is the fact that the pacing of both progression and combat is all over the place. The fact that I gained like 30 levels in an hour after the game kept me under level 30 for most of the game is just wild, because that sudden burst of progression out of nowhere got in the way of a combat system that had just started to really open up and feel really great to mess around with. And it's not like I went out of my way grinding, I was just doing the side content as it was presented to me. In fact, I didn't really grind on this game in any way whatsoever, and to run into these huge pacing issues and spite of that, is to my mind the greatest problem this game has, mostly because it actively cuts into the other parts of the game, which are some of its best stuff. And that ultimately brings me to my conclusion. Visions of Mana is a solid JRPG. It's probably not going to blow you away, but there isn't really any one part of it that I would call specifically bad other than that one part of the story I'm not going to mention here for spoilers' sake, but we did talk about in the story section. And overall, it's simply a solid game that's probably not going to disappoint you, but also probably isn't going to blow you away either. And when you start talking price is where that becomes a bit of an issue, because they are charging a full $60 US for this one, and while the game is decent, I just don't see myself paying that price for it, because I think that's a little much for what this game is. Now, personally, as I mentioned, I bought this game on the Steam Winter Sale for about $40, which I think was a much more reasonable price. I feel pretty good about having paid $40 for this, and that's about what I would say most people should pay for it. So as a result of that, I would say this is a good game for about $40, and thus I would buy it on sale, which is pretty much going to do it for this particular review. So I hope you enjoyed that look at this particular game, but by all means let me know how you feel about it down in the comment section below, assuming you've played it or just have any thoughts about the review itself, I suppose, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.